Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that everyone is so busy at the moment, so really appreciate you taking the time. My name's Rebecca Pierre. I'm a professional officer from Baswa, England, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of our mapping document of the professional capability standards. So just so everyone's aware what to expect, the purpose of the webinar is to provide a brief overview of the document, to outline why and how it was created, but more importantly to discuss the relevance to both students and practitioners of all levels. I know that as someone recently out of practice myself, I really wish that I would have had this sort of guide when I was trying to navigate all of the different standards and how they work together, especially when I was really time poor a lot of the time, and with COVID-19 as well. I think everyone here can relate to the fact that there's increasing moral dilemmas and ethical dilemmas to navigate, so it really is with pleasure that we introduce this. And as a professional officer supporting this work as well, it's been really rewarding working in conjunction with those with lived experience, people at all stages of practice, and stakeholders including Social Work England, the Chief Social Workers, JUC-SWEC, as well as our very valued BASWA members. So I'd really like to thank everyone who contributed to the guidance. We're just going to quickly go over to a quote from the Chief Social Workers as well. So the Chief Social Worker has said, the Chief Social Workers for Children and Adults welcome the launch of and mapping of the PCF, KSS and professional regulatory standards. We know that social workers need to understand how each area complements their learning, development and understanding of all the standards, and the mapping document makes this much clearer for both practitioners and their supervisors. It's really important to our profession that we have the building blocks to develop our skills, our learning and our practice while working in many varied and complex areas of social work. This document simplifies the pathways to achieving this, and we would strongly advocate its wide use both in statutory and independent social work settings, and to encourage teams and individuals to draw on it to complement their current work, but also to help them plan their continuing professional development for the future. And I'd just like to add at this time, if you are a student, if you're here today, I think everyone here has so much respect for you. It must be enormously difficult trying to absorb information and do placements virtually online. So that is absolutely to be applauded. Just going to set some housekeeping as well. So as everyone knows, the event's being recorded, and if you've joined the webinar, you'll be observers and you won't be able to verbally participate. So I'll introduce each of our guests when it's time to. We really want this to be as interactive as we can, given the circumstances. So if you do want to ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to use the questions box, and that can be found by clicking the speech bubble. It's got two small lines in it at the top right corner, so it might appear slightly differently if you're using a phone or tablet to access the event as well. There's no such thing as a stupid question as well. We've heard it all before, so please do ask away. And as we progress through the webinar, we really do want to hear from you. Some of you joining the webinar may already have some knowledge, in fact, a lot of knowledge and experience of what will be discussed, or you might have questions about the information being shared, so do get in touch. And we're really encouraging anyone who's on Twitter to use that during the session as well. So if you would like to tweet during the webinar, we'll pop this in the chat as well because they're quite wordy, but we've got two hashtags. The first one is hashtag England SW Standards, and the second one is hashtag PCF Social Work. So we're always really keen to engage any viewers after the event. I'm sure that you'll have questions and queries beyond this. So if you want to make contact or get involved in any future work streams in this area, if you could get in touch, I'll drop my email at the bottom here, but it's Rebecca, spelt this very awkward way, rebecca.pierre@baswa.co.uk. And just so you know who it is that we've got joining us today, we've got representatives from the Office of the Chief Social Worker for Adults in the Department of Health and Social Care, the BASWA Professional Capabilities and Development Group, and the BASWA Student and NQSW Group. And they'll all be sharing their views from different perspectives about how exactly the document relates to and supports practice. Maris Stratoulis, our BASWA England National Director, sent her apologies for today's event, and she'd like to thank members and peers who've been involved in the production. So we're now going to hand over to Ruth Allen, who's the CEO of BASWA, and she's going to provide a brief overview of the guidance in terms of purpose, creation and collaboration.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. I didn't know I had a frog in my throat. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Becca, for that. I'm really delighted to be here. I've worked closely on this project with all my colleagues in BASWA England over the last, well, probably 6-9 months. So it's been very rewarding. We started this as a bit of a desktop look at the relationship between the PCF, KSS and regulatory standards last year, because we'd been asked on really many occasions by social workers and others about this and about how this sometimes rather complex and confusing picture could be made a bit more clear and a bit more straightforward. And then that was followed up with the consultations that Becca's already talked about, with BASWA members, with other social workers and stakeholders, crucially with people with lived experience. And I'd have to say at the round table that we held with a lot of stakeholders towards the end of last year, the voice of people with lived experience was particularly strong and valuable in helping us think about doing this, about some of the detail, but also in terms of the value of bringing about this clarity. So the document has gained a lot of support. We know there are other developments. There are ongoing these standards and frameworks are not static, and there are other frameworks which are hugely important. But the three that are covered in the mapping document, so the professional capabilities framework, the knowledge and skills statements, and of course the regulatory standards from Social Work England are absolutely crucial and core. And in producing this, we would obviously hope that we will continue to get feedback and that we will continue to be able to develop this. So I'm going to run through just quickly what the structure of the document is. So could I have the next slide, please? So we obviously BASWA is hosting on behalf of the sector the professional capabilities framework, and we're very committed to this very holistic framework and to keeping it fresh and relevant and always to be clear about how it relates to and adds to the learning frameworks and the practice frameworks that social workers are working in. So it is generic, of course, across the whole of social work, and crucially, it's profession owned. So it's independent of government, it's independent of particular policy areas, it's independent of employers. And that's where it's come from. It's come from the profession and it's come with that independence. And we've had it now for about 10 years. And of course, we're working with the refreshed version that we did in 2018. And the importance of this is that it offers a holistic framework for all of social work and for social work at all stages of a career, from pre-qualifying right through to advanced and strategic levels. And so it's also its independence and the way it's emerged from the sector is very important, because it means it has a long life and it can evolve and it can change and it can adapt. But it's very well owned and across the sector still. And we're constantly checking out really what people's views of it are. But it's a very important framework. So this is obviously at the core of the document. And the document actually, which I'll come on to in a bit, the document uses the 3 super domains of the PCF, which are impact, practice, and purpose, or purpose, practice, and impact, and considers how the domains under each of those, of which there are 3 under each, relate to the KSS and the regulatory standards. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So the knowledge and skill statements are there, as we said. The ones that we are comparing or looking at the relationship between PCF and regulatory standards, and the KSS that we're looking at are the Chief Social Worker for Adults and Children and Families Social Worker generic core statements. And that the document is in two parts, one which deals with the PCF, the regulatory standards in relation to adults knowledge and skill statements, and the second part related to children and families knowledge and skills statements. So hopefully that will help you navigate it depending on where you're working, but it is one document, so it's kind of I kind of think it's good to read through the whole thing if you're interested in this, and that's why you're here. But then to kind of really look at the parts that are most relevant to you. So the knowledge and skill statements, we're only looking at the ones for children and family and adults practitioners at a kind of general level. There are other post-qualifying standards which kind of fit into the knowledge and skill statements broader stable, which have come out of Department of Health and Social Care, Department for Education, the Chief Social Workers. But the ones that we're looking at are the ones which are the fundamental skills and knowledge for practitioners. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the professional regulatory standards, the minimum or threshold standards that are considered necessary for safe and effective practice that we all need to meet as registered social workers in England. I would want to say that when we started on this piece of work, we did it in close collaboration and discussion with Social Work England and with Chief Social Workers for Adults and Children. So they've been involved in the consultations throughout. So this mapping document is coming forward on the understanding that it's going to be really beneficial for all the organisations involved and all the stakeholders involved in these different these different areas that are driving these different documents, these different sources of guidance that are driving our profession. So if we could go down to the next slide, please. So this is the, I think they look a little bit like aliens. I rather like these. So this is how it looks diagrammatically. You have this is for adults, as you can see here, the mapping diagram. So it has the purpose, impact and practice superdomain, and underneath that you have got the elements of PCF, KSS and the regulatory standards that most fit within, that most kind of cluster together and that are kind of mutually supportive, really, and possibly talking about the same topics in slightly different ways, which is interesting, and I'll come on to that. And kind of hopefully substantiating each other and sort of supporting each other. So the numbers there, you've got the PCF domain numbers, so under purpose 2, 3, 4. The KSS, you've got paragraphs, numbered paragraphs that are covered there, and the regulatory professional standards, and you've got 1, 3, and 5, and those are the overarching headers under which there are a number of lines of particular capability or particular requirements that are required for registration. So I think that's quite clear. You'll see, I think, from this that if you look under the practice domain, you've got a lot of a larger number of paragraphs out of the KSS really mapping onto that practice, which is the knowledge and skills, the critical reflection, those whole areas of kind of what we actually do in practice. And it's unsurprising perhaps that the knowledge and skills statement is kind of quite packed with things that map onto the practice domains of the PCF. And you'll also see there's more under the regulatory professional standards in relation to practice as well, slightly more. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide, which is essentially the same kind of thing, only for the children and families. So for the PCF and the regulatory standards, those things are essentially the same. The difference here is the mapping onto the knowledge and skills statement, which is obviously children and families specific. And again, you can see there's a lot of parts of the knowledge and skills statement which map particularly onto the knowledge, skills, interventions, critical analysis and reflection parts of practice. So let's go on. Visual learners will like that. I thought they'd gone for a bit, and then I suddenly realised that was my misreading. They're definitely still there in the document, and I think that's really helpful, and hopefully a simple, quick guide to how some of these relationships work. Go on to the next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and it's just to talk a little bit about using the document and to give you an example. So I think it is helpful potentially to read through the whole document, but probably the most useful thing is to use it, and I think it will work really well as a reflective and a critical reflective tool and a learning tool, and to think about how the different languages that are used, slightly different languages that are used, slightly different concepts that are used in these different guidance and standard setting documents support each other, and what the differences and nuances might mean. I've just pulled out as an example the PCF domain 3, which is about diversity and equality. And the domain descriptor there is, as you can see here on the top left, recognise diversity, apply anti-discriminatory and anti-oppressive principles in practice. That's the header, and then there's a slightly longer descriptor there and underneath this, of course, within the PCF, there are then the specific capabilities that sit at each of 9 levels, starting from pre-qualifying right through to advanced and strategic social work, that expand on this definition. So the definition that starts, social workers understand that. So the paragraph under there. And the way in which this works with the KSS, this is from the adults part of the document. So an example is that under that there are some other parts of the KSS and regulatory standards that may relate to this part of the PCF, but 2 key elements are this relates to the KSS talking about they must understand the impact of poverty, inequality and diversity on social and economic opportunities and how these relate to people's health and well-being. And then the regulatory standards talking about recognising differences across different diverse communities. This is regulatory standard 1.5, that social workers must challenge the impact of disadvantage and discrimination on people and their families and communities and promote social justice, helping to confront and resolve issues of inequality and inclusion. So I think you can see there how that raises, it shows you some of the ways in which these parts, these different standards and guidances fit together and support each other. They also raises perhaps some questions about why language is used in one way in one part and in another. And I would hope that rather than finding that kind of just confusing, that people will find it a learning tool that helps you actually think more deeply, in this case around diversity and equality, and also kind of give some confidence that if you are working, for instance, to guidance that's from the PCF or from the KSS, you can really understand and see where you can map that against, for instance, your must-dos within the regulatory standards. So I want to thank all my colleagues and all our stakeholders and all our experts by experience who've helped us create this document, and I really hope that it's really useful. Thank you. Becca, back to you.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Really interesting, and as a visual learner I can 100% relate to how this would have been really useful. I wish I could go back in time and give myself that. We're now going to hand over to Namal Jude from the Office of the Chief Social Worker for Adults, which is in the Department of Health and Social Care, who's going to reflect on the importance of mapping the professional standards and the value this can bring to practitioners.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks, Ruth, for that really helpful introduction and kind of tour through the document. So hello, everyone. I am Namal Jude, as I was just introduced. I am a registered social worker. I'm also a BASWA member. I'm also a practice educator. So these standards apply to me as they do probably to most of you in this session today. So as it says up on the slide, I am the part-time policy advisor at the Office of Chief Social Workers, and for the other half of the week I'm the head of practice in need of evidence for the What Works for Children's Social Care Centre. So I've got a kind of a vision into adults and children's. I was sort of reflecting on this, and I think, Ruth, I was probably one of those people who was kind of shouting quite loudly about the need for this this tool. So I'm personally delighted to see those kind of early conversations come to fruition now. And I think, like others have said already, and I'm sure others after this session, it's a really welcome tool. Could I have the next slide? I think I've got one more slide. I've just got one slide. So yeah, a really welcome tool that kind of brings together all the key standards, and we know that this is the start of this journey, and we see that. And it doesn't cover all of the standards, but it's really good to see that at least the key standards coming together in this way. And I'm also a visual learner, so I'm also happy to see them like that. I think that these standards are going to be so beneficial for students and practitioners. Certainly myself in my practice, always going back to the PCF, always checking out regulatory standards, thinking about post-qualifying standards when supporting staff and organisations. So we see how this tool will help practitioners pre and post qualify to really kind of navigate throughout their career, not just in those early stages of being newly qualified, but throughout their career. And I think that also for the profession, for our profession, for social work, it also helps us when we're trying to build our careers. So if you're students, or if you're newly qualified and you're on this call, or even if you're at the other end of that spectrum and you're thinking about how you're going to broaden and build your practice, we see how this also gives you that kind of line of sight to see how you might kind of map and track your practice and your career, really. So really welcome again. And I suppose the other thing is about, and I think Ruth touched on it just there when she gave the example about helping you to think deeply, and particularly in relevance to the example she used about equality and diversity, and how this tool can really help you in your CPD as well. And I think that we've seen a lot, haven't we, that sometimes practitioners through their once they qualify find it feel that it's a luxury to kind of really spend some reflective time revisiting, looking at standards, making sense of their practice. And part of that has been that it's been quite complex because everything is kind of spread out. So I can certainly see, and certainly when I was talking to Fran Ledra and Mark Harvey, the two chief social workers for adults, we were having that conversation of how useful this tool will be for CPD as well, and how managers can use it during kind of appraisals and supervision processes. And as Ruth was saying, it's early stages, it doesn't cover all of them, but I think we need that fluidity. We need to be able to kind of work with it and get feedback and see how people use it and what benefit it has. So a very kind of brief talk from me, really, just kind of saying that I'm really happy to see this. I have been at the start of when the PCF was created, was showing my age a little bit now, and so have seen standards change through the years and new standards come in as well. So yeah, really will be watching and being involved closely with the further developments. So thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. I really relate to your point about how once you're actually in practice, it can definitely feel like a luxury, finding the time to reflect, especially if you're, going from pillar to post to visits to emergency meetings, child protection conferences. So this is just a really helpful tool to almost bring the ethics really to the forefront without you having to trawl through lots of different documents at once. So really helpful, thank you. We're now going to hand over to Jenny Burton. Jenny's both part of the BASWA Professional Capabilities and Development Group, and she's also an independent practice educator and mentor/assessor for PEPS PE learners. So she's now going to reflect on the need for the mapping from a practice perspective.
Thank you very much, Becca. Yes, I'm here from an independent practice educator perspective, and really sort of last academic year and this year, I've been sort of very aware of the challenges that have affected students on their placements because of COVID-19, of course. And that's introduced quite a lot of differences and disparities. Some students have had shortened placements, others have had, you know, they haven't been able to work directly with families anymore. You know, there's been lots of very creative thinking that's had to happen. And, you know, I really do applaud employers and universities, you know, for taking, you know, that extra time to try and work through all the tensions that we've got. But I think, you know, now more than ever, we do need a robust and holistic set of mapping tools to give that consistency and quality assurance across all placements. I recently attended some training, actually, which was called Team Around the Student. And I found that really interesting because, you know, it was looking at the importance of us all working together with the student, you know, whether it's the practice educator or the supervisor or the tutor, because of the fact that we need to have that shared learning culture. And I think, you know, we need those resources. You know, one set of integrated tools is going to really help with that. I think the other thing I wanted to mention that, you know, all of you that are practice educators out there, you know that it's quite a challenging and demanding role, and you have to wear lots of different hats. You know, you have to be a supervisor, facilitator, educator, and you have to assess students. And it's quite a vital decision to be making out there on placement. And I think for myself, as a practice educator, I really do need a good set of tools and resources to support me when I'm making those informed judgments about the student's professional capability. So I think having all the resources in one place is good for both formative and summative assessment. I think the other thing Ruth mentioned, the different stages of development, you know, from the student's journey from the point of entry right to experience levels of social work practice. And I think that during that incremental journey, different aspects of the mapping document may take priority. So, you know, for students that are going through their placements, they're being assessed using the PCF. At the moment, the KSF is quite prominent for the newly qualified and for the ASYE. And then, of course, the regulatory standards, very important all the way through, but maybe have more dominance as students register, and the importance of CPD and, you know, that commitment to personal professional development. So each of the different aspects, all the different mapping documents are slightly different, but having them all together and having a sort of a unified overview is really important. It's a really important point of contact, I think, for students and professionals. Just thinking about the social work profession, I mean, I just think that, you know, maybe now more than ever, social work needs to present a strong and united front, and we need a set of clear integrated standards. PCF, KSF and the regulatory standards, they're all really vital. They complement each other. They're different, but the fact that we've actually consulted, you know, so many people have consulted to actually get this document together and recognise the synergy and also the differences and how they inform and complement each other. I just wanted to say just briefly, I like the design as well of the mapping tools. I think that, you know, the overarching or the super domains They provide a really good overview. You've got purpose, practice and impact, and how they resonate with KSS and the regulatory standards. It's a bit of a hackneyed phrase, but I think it is sort of like the golden thread that runs through the whole thing. And it can be seen as a whole holistic document, or it can be, looked at as part of reflective practice for learners and for assessors. I think, to conclude, I really welcome this at this point in time. I was involved in the PCF refresh and then the PEPS refresh last year. And I think once again, BASWA have come up with something that's going to it's going to keep the social work profession fresh and vibrant and live and meaningful. And we need that. We need tools to keep the practice thriving so that social workers can, effectively support and enable the people that we work with. Those were my points, and I think I've probably covered all of them. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. It's so valuable to hear from a practice educator's perspective, and really just reflecting on one of the words you used there was synergy. And I think at the moment, at a time where we're all isolated and it feels like we're so distant in our own separate bubbles, now is a time for unity and synergy. So thanks so much for that. We're now going to hand over to Pam. Pam is one of our amazing BASWA students. She's Vice Chair of the BASWA Student and NQSW group. And she's going to reflect on her kind of thoughts about the need for the mapping from an ASYE perspective. So over to you, Pam.
Sorry, classic mistake. Got my mute button on. Right, so thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of this. And I definitely echo what everybody else has said. I think it's an amazing tool. As a student, qualified just about a year ago, and now coming to the end of my ASYE, I think that this tool is really an amazing tool, as it brings together although different aspects of practice, but actually they all sort of complement each other. And, it's really nice to be able to see that, especially for somebody like me who's very visual in my learning. I'm just reflecting from a student perspective, because as I said, I qualified about a year ago, and thinking about how this tool would have really helped me in that time. As a student on placement, there's always that expectation that your practice must underpin the principles of the PCF. And you do get a bit of that in theory, obviously, at university. But when you then get to placement, it's a completely different atmosphere. And then you have to then be thinking about how you are going to be evidencing these things in your portfolio. And so that can be very difficult to do. But when you have a tool like this, that sort of brings everything together, it makes reflection really easy. And then post-qualification, obviously now I'm having to use the KSS as well, and also my knowledge of the PCF. Initially, I found it really, really difficult to be able to do that, because I'm thinking, oh my God, now I've got to now learn the KSS and then, the PCF. So it did get a bit daunting for me at first. But again, this is where I find that this tool will be very useful to be able to help me in seeing how they all come together and actually are saying the same thing in a lot of the aspects of practice. So for me, having knowledge of these principles can be difficult from a student's perspective, even if you may already be meeting this requirement in practice. But it is important to understand how all these three principles come together and how they inform your practice, because then it helps you to be reflective when you're actually undertaking tasks. So yes, for me, I thought it's brilliant, really, really brilliant how they all sort of complement each other. And yes, I have talked about reflection, because it's something that, although as you become more and more experienced in practice, it becomes more difficult, because you're then having to undertake a lot more you're on the go. It gets very busy. Reflection is not something that that you do as you get more into practice. But I think that it's a very important aspect of practice, because when you're able to actually sit back and think about how your practice is actually impacting on the people that you're working with, and even impacting on yourself, it then helps to inform how you make those necessary changes going forward. And again, this is something that I think that this tool will be very useful for. One of the things that you asked me to talk about, which I think is really important, is how the COVID-19 is impacting on student and practice at the minute. So because I'm currently an ASYE, and I'll say I was somewhat lucky to have qualified just before COVID became qualified in January, or started working in January. So I was lucky to have had the opportunity to have met my team and got the support that I needed before we then started to work from home. But then now reflecting on how difficult it was after, even though I did get that support, from April I've been working from home and I've not had any actual support from my team, face-to-face support, and that has been really difficult. And then I think it becomes a lot more challenging as a student when you're not actually seeing your practice educators face-to-face. You're having to do a lot of your learning to be creative, to adapt learning in this really, really difficult time. And I think that at this moment in time, it's just a really tough time to be a student. I think what makes it even more challenging is social work is very dependent on relationship building. And if you're not able to actually do that at the moment, that is really, really difficult. So now I'm having to take responsibility for being creative, to be able to evidence those aspects of the PCFs in the portfolios. And then, if you're not getting that extra support, how are you able to actually meet those requirements in your PCFs? And then how does that help you when you actually when you qualify post-qualification? How do you actually, what have you learned that you can actually take into practice? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges I think COVID has actually thrown into that. But I think on a positive note, I would say that although, yes, we have all of these challenges at the moment, I think that everyone who is currently going through this will build amazing skills that we can take on to become much better practitioners. It's very unique skills, I think, that, if you've actually been through this process, high levels of resilience that people have shown, practice educators, universities are having to, because there's no definitive or clear guidance as to what people need to do. Even the government aren't sort of giving us any, people are just having to be thinking outside of the box, maybe to support students, and students are also taking their learning into their own hands as well. So I think that on a positive note, when this is all over, we'll be, much more, I'm not saying we're not brilliant at the moment, but I'm saying that, we will be much better at our jobs, because we would have gained so many skills that we can take into practice and be much better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam. I just want to read out some of the comments applauding you and all students who are going above at the above and beyond at the moment. You're amazingly resilient. So Sylvia Mackenzie, she has said students are remarkable in doing everything remotely, which I completely agree with. And we've got Helen Love as well, who said students, NQSWs, hats off to you. I can't begin to imagine what it must be like for you at the moment. And we've got another comment in. We've seen amazing creativity in making placements and ASYE programmes work. So fantastic. And I'd also like to take the opportunity, Pam, if you don't mind, to just congratulate you again. Pam's recently got the role of Vice Chair for our student and NQSW group. You can see from that 5 minutes just how amazingly insightful Pam is. So really, really can't wait to work with you, Pam. And I'd really just encourage anyone who is working with students at the moment, do signpost them to the group. Pam, if you wouldn't mind dropping your Twitter there as well, it'd be great to kind of broaden those connections as well. And thank you ever so much. So we've now heard from all of our speakers. We'd now like to open the floor to a Q&A session. I can't promise we'll be able to answer everything, but if there's something we can't answer, what I can promise is we'll go away and find out. So what's going to happen is I'm going to read out some of the questions. Do feel free to keep them coming. I'll then hand over to our panelists and ask who feels best equipped to answer, and we'll go from there. So I'm just going to look at my list of questions over here. Thank you for bearing with me. OK, so one question is RPS the new official title? We've been referring to them as professional standards. Yeah.
Shall I jump in?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for that. We yes, professional standards, regulatory standards. We wanted to just clarify that in our abbreviation that we were meaning the regulatory, spelling it out basically, the regulatory professional standards that obviously distinguish those from anything else that we might call standards in, say, a particular part of social work. And so they are, in a sense, standard setting legally for us to be registered sits with the regulator. So we wanted to be very clear that we meant that was referring to the regulatory professional standards. And I'm sure people will continue to talk about professional standards as well in other contexts. But when you're comparing different frameworks, it's important to say, to be very explicit. So it was really to make it more explicit.
Thanks for that, Ruth. That's really helpful. The next question is, will the PEPS Refresh 2019 statement also be modified, i.e. it maps with PCF and KSS, but not the regulatory professional standards? Ruth, is that one for yourself?
It might be one more for Jenny.
Or Jenny?
Jenny knows all about the practice educator standards, but it's an area of development, I guess, as I think Nimal used the word fluid, and there's an ongoing process of development. If you develop one part, you have to look at another. So Jenny, maybe you'd like to comment on that.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, it's constantly being monitored, and we're having questions from people all the time, to see how, the way they're doing it fits into the PEPS guidance. And I think it's something that we're going to be revisiting I think we said in about 6 months' time, once we've had some feedback from the full launch, which was at the end of September this year. To really get a feel for how it's been rolled out, and if there have been any issues, and if there's anything else, any further guidance that needs to be added. So it's very much a fresh and ongoing situation. Yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. That's really helpful. The next question, are the PCF used in social work training and KSS for ASYE? I get totally overwhelmed which and where they are used.
Shall I have a go? Shall I have a go?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I mean, I can speak for myself and, our colleagues. And I sort of alluded to this earlier. I use the PCF throughout my career, so there are different levels as you sort of progress through your career, and the same is said for the regulatory standards as well, because we've had to renew recently our registration, and the CPD. When you're kind of submitting your CPD, you're looking at the regulatory standards, but you're also holding in mind which level of the PCF you're at in terms of the kind of breadth and depth of your role, perhaps. And then, of course, you've got the kind of post-qualifying standards, depending on which role you're in within children's or adults. So I suppose that's what I was meaning when I was trying to explain that this brings all of those together, and it really does depend on where you are in your career. So the short answer is you use all of them through your practice as you kind of move through different roles and maybe have a different focus on a different area of social work. Hope I've got that right, but that's certainly how I use it.
That's so helpful. Ruth, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think you got that very right, Nimal, and I think they are all relevant. And in a way, the challenge for us as professionals is to use these tools to improve whatever it is we're doing for the benefit of the people that we're working with, so that they are resources. sometimes standards and frameworks can feel like they're driving things. I think we have to, as professionals, see them as resources that we use, we make sense of, and we check that sense making through our supervision and, of course, with the people we work with. I suppose the KSS, as we said, as we agreed with in our joint statement with Chief Social Workers, Children and Adults in 2018, map more into the practice domains, for instance, of the PSPCF, because they're more about what you do in practice on a day-to-day basis in a particular context, which is largely statutory adults or statutory children's social work, and of course, and that's where most people have are doing their ASYEs as well. So it kind of comes to life a bit, I think, around that. But I think the importance of the PCF for the whole career, the importance of the regulatory standards, and indeed the KSS at different points in your career, regulatory standards throughout your career is really important. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just say from a student perspective, just first-hand experience. So I used the PCF. There was a lot more focus on the PCF when I was a student, and that was, we had to evidence that throughout our portfolios and during placement as well. But for students who had the opportunity to go into statutory placements, they had to evidence that in their in supervision with in your statutory placement. So they then got first-hand knowledge of the KSS. So obviously coming back, when we all come back together and talking about placement experiences, and we're like, oh, what is the KSS? You know, I don't know what that is. But then now doing my ASYE, now having to try and find my way around my knowledge of the PCF and then sort of bringing that into my KSS knowledge. But I think the good thing that you find is that they actually do interlink. There's a lot that sort of interconnects with the PCF and the KSS, and so that's why I said that I find this document really, really, really good, and I'm hoping that going forward, actually, it would be used across every level of practice, be student, ASYE, and throughout your social work career.
Great, thanks, Pam. And maybe this is something we can kind of bring up to students at our meeting on Monday as well. That's brilliant. Just going on to the next question. I currently support ASYEs and student social workers. Would it be okay to start sharing this with ASYE students, other team members to start using from now and referencing in paperwork for skills for care? I'm going to imagine yes.
I think so. It's a resource, and what it's drawing on are all the source materials that students and people in training and ASYEs need to be using anyway. As we've been saying, it brings it together, so it's the source material brought together in a new way. So yeah, absolutely, get it out there.
Fabulous. Okay, question from Luke Tibbets, who's a colleague. I don't think he's here today. With the social work apprenticeship degree becoming an ever more important qualifying route nationally, will the apprenticeship standards, oh dear, I can't see that, also be added to the mapping moving forward? So I will just say they are referenced at the end, but I'm going to hand over to Ruth for that.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we understand how indeed things like the apprenticeship standards are going to fit with this going forward. So it's not in there now, but it's referenced, as Becca was saying. And in fact, we were talking about this just yesterday, saying this is something we need to really really understand and think about how people coming through an apprenticeship route are supported by whether it's by a version of this or an addendum, or that we understand how to integrate that. So we'll be looking at that further. Apprenticeships are not totally new, but they're kind of new, aren't they? They are. I think we're still needing to fully understand what the learning needs are going to be of apprentices and how they might differ from other routes. So that's something for us to really work on. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you. Shelley Harding, so sorry, I don't think I can actually see your question. So if you wouldn't mind just retyping it, would really appreciate that. I've got another question as well that came in via email, which was, is there a hierarchy amongst these and how does that work? Would anyone like to take that one?
I could go again, but does anybody else like to have a go at that one? I could give a quick quick view, and then I'd be really interested in my other panelists' views on this. I mean, it's very clear that each of these frameworks, they are a different part of our professional landscape. Basically, we have regulatory standards are our legal go-tos in order to register and call ourselves social workers. That's absolutely clear and uncontrovertible. They are the minimum standards that we have to meet. PCF is aspirational standards as well as foundational. It's also aspirational and career long. So, and it's more of a reflective tool for use throughout a career. And I think what's important about it for us as a profession is its independence, and the fact that we can have PCF, whatever else is going on in the social work firmament and policy and so on and so forth, we can have something that can keep evolving, that we can own as a profession, and that is holistic for one profession, which is really important as well. The KSS, I mean, clearly they've been incredibly important guidance for particular areas of practice, particularly in statutory work, as we've already been describing, and have really informed the ASYEs when students, newly qualified, come into starting to do the job. And they've got a lot of content about specific kinds of interventions, types of work in detail that you might do in particular contexts. People work in myriad parts of social work, don't they? They work in all sorts of contexts, and not all in statutory work, even at qualifying level. So the PCF kind of reaches into all the different parts of social work. And then there are, of course, the things that you might need to know specifically if you're working in palliative care social work, or working with refugees, or working around domestic violence, whatever it is. You've got to have your own learning and development that is about that specialism that you might be going into. So for you, that might well be your priority, to really learn those things. So they are different. One is our legal basis. The others are about us developing and are obviously core to our professionalism in that. And the others are, in a sense, core to our ongoing professionalism and development of specialism. So I'd see it like that, really.
Thank you, Ruth. We've got a quick one. Do we know whether the review of children's services by the frontline CEO cover any of these issues?
I don't have an answer to that. It's very, very new, recently announced. I don't know, Nimal, if you've got any thoughts on that. No. Yeah, very, very new. I think what we would hope, of course, is that a review of children's social care or care services will be thinking very much about professional guidance, quality, and we would hope that it would relate to all of the great work that's going on across the sector to uphold standards, and we'll take that on, we'll take that on board. As the review unfolds. We have to always remember there's fantastic work going on in social work, in all sorts of places, in all sorts of working environments, in all sorts of universities, in all sorts of training, qualifying, post-qualifying. We need to make sure that great work has a voice, in any developmental pieces of work like the care review. As well as we will be challenged. We need to be challenged. We always need to be challenged.
Thank you, Ruth. Just a quick one. Time has flown by, but just so everyone's aware, we've got 5 minutes left. So if you've been sitting on a question, not sure whether to ask it, do ask. Now is your chance. I've got one from Rachel. Oh, heck, it's a comment. If you're doing work around social work apprenticeships, I would like to be involved. Fantastic, Rachel. If you can just email Debbie, if you wouldn't mind just popping the email, that would be brilliant. It would be great to have you on board, Rachel, and that goes to anyone who's here. I know that there's so many experts, there's such rich knowledge here, so we'd love you to be involved. Another email question is very simple. How do I know what to look to first? Anyone like to answer that?
I think, just to say, it really depends on what part of the journey you're on. I mean, I think, for me as a practice educator, I'm all into the PCF with my students, and I also have apprenticeship students. And I think that the PCF at that point, it's a really good point of reference to the other sets of standards, and also those that aren't included in this mapping tool. You know, you've got the BASWA Code of Ethics, which is one I use an awful lot with my students and with my PEPS practice educators. It's lovely to be able to just cross-reference and make those links so much more easily with the mapping tools that we've got now.
Thanks, Jenny. Another
Thanks.
email.
Thanks,
Sorry,
Jenny.
go on, Ruth. I think you were going to say.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and just to say that the PCF does cross-reference with the Code of Ethics now, which rather more strongly since the 2018 refresh. Just because not just because it's important. These connections need to be made. These things are not separate things. A lot of these things are the synergy, the word that you use, Jenny, is so important. Yeah.
Thanks, Ruth. Another email question we've got is, how long will this be valid for? So I'll answer part of this, but then I'll pass on. We're very keen that this is relevant and up to date, and we know that social work evolves very fast. I know that we're going to make a real commitment to review this regularly. If there's anything that needs adapting or changing, we will take that on board, and we'll constantly kind of review and update the document. I don't know if anyone else has anything to chip in there. Nope.
Thank you all for your interest, and get involved. Use the tool, disseminate.
Excellent. It looks like we've got time for one quick more question. We've got 2 minutes left, which is, what does this mean for university curriculum?
I think or Jenny, you might want to come in on this one actually. I mean, I think the university curriculum for social work is obviously will be reviewed. Social Work England will be looking at the curriculum for universities, and obviously BASWA is talking closely with Social Work England about what that direction of travel, and hopefully this document will help inform that process and clarify some of the things you were saying, Jenny, about, for instance, how it's used now very effectively. The PCF is used very effectively at the moment with students, but also how that then absolutely must link with the journey that people are on as they go into practice, as they need to be prepared for practice, as they need to be prepared for registration. We all need to be involved in making that journey clear and smooth, as well, and holding on to the kind of the values and ethics that underpin that should underpin social work education. Jenny, you might have a few thoughts on that.
I think just to say that different social work curriculums will be mapping the different practice learning modules and all the modules actually, and using this as a set of really important resources. They'll all do it slightly differently, but they will be there, and they will be a really important part of the students' learning journey, and also for post-qualifying social work training, of course. So I think, when courses, curriculums are being reviewed by social working, this is going to be a very important aspect that hopefully, they'll expect to be fully demonstrated.
Thank you, Jen. I know that we're coming to the end of our time now. Just want to say again, thank you so much to everyone who's been involved. We don't want the conversation to end here. If you're interested in being part of any of our working groups related to, this document or future work streams, do keep in touch. Do as well make a post on Twitter if this is something that you feel would help students or practitioners or even yourself. Thank you so much for your time, and look forward to seeing you all soon.